everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Looks like we still have people joining as we speak, but I'll just get started with a little bit of housekeeping. So today all of our attendees are muted and not sharing any video, but you can communicate with us via the chat and Q&A functions, which can be found just at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Do send in your questions throughout the webinar. We will be doing a Q&A session towards the end. And just to let you know, we have a few poll questions which will be running throughout the session. I'm going to launch the first one of those now. So you should all be able to vote on your screens in just a moment. So this question is aimed at helping us understand who we have joining us today. So if you could all just vote on your screens, that would be great. Fantastic. Can see some votes coming in for those now, so I'll just give that a few more moments while you all share where you're joining us from. Fantastic. So nearly everyone has voted, so I'll just give that a few more seconds and then I'll share the results of that. So it looks like we've got a nice mix of people joining us from different areas. So some people from an industry background, also some residents and training directors. So that's great to see. Just a few more seconds for the last votes to come in, and then I will hand over to Chris Scattergood, who is our host for today. Great, so I'm going to end that one there. And with that, I will hand over to Chris. Over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our third webinar in the series that we've been delivering in partnership with the AOS. In this series of webinars, we've been looking at how COVID has changed education in orthopedics globally. We've been looking also at how residency and training programs have adjusted to those changes and what technologies have been employed and have been used and what barriers to those technologies have come across in terms of adopting them in programs. Today, we addressed a topic that came from the last webinar, and that was what specifically can be included within the VR curriculum and how can industry support this and in turn benefit from it themselves. So in terms of the agenda today, I'm going to be introducing each speaker as we get to them. We have with us Professor Duncan Tennant, who joins us from St. George's, thank you. Dr. Jit Balakuma of Melbourne Orthopedics, thank you so much for joining us today, Jit. I know that it's middle of the night over there. Dr. Stephanie Pearce of Colorado, who represents the AOS, also as the Vice Chair of their Residents Assembly. And from NYU, we have Dr. Vinay Agarwal. So thank you all for joining us. Thanks again to the AOS, in particular for their support in this space and on partnering with us on these programs. So back to the first question. What is needed in the VR curriculum and how can industry support this? Let's take a very quick recap of what some of the leading training programs have said about this from the previous webinars we run. We've got a really short clip here which summarizes some of the thoughts on the subject.
So, what are our barriers and our strategies to address this? Now, for the cost idea, I think advocacy is important. And of course, I love acronyms, and I canvass some of my colleagues to come up with a good acronym to come up with some sort of a policy position. Mentor, medical education, innovation, and technology and residency, creating some sort of a bill to see if we can fund this through federal program to say that our residency programs need funding for technology, as we've learned through this COVID crisis.
Is that every resident, and in Victoria we've got 45 residents, will be able to own a VR unit with preloaded software, that it's industry and resident sponsored. So I'm in a very good position to be able to leverage that, and hopefully we can pursue that in the future, that it can be uploaded into the curriculum. So we want that to be a core competency as there is in the UK. And again, I've been working with the AOA to try and incorporate that. We have a working group for this.
AAOS is extremely supportive of utilizing technology for education of both Academy Fellows as well as the trainees. And they've had a lot of different modalities kind of come out through the orthopedic video theater, and then working on creating more of the virtual reality courses the virtual courses. And I thought Dr. Lejean made a great point about how industry could kind of combine in the future with VR programs to create a hands-on, if you will, interactive virtual surgical course where we can utilize the virtual reality to kind of move forward with the educational.
The hardest one is the surgical training. Obviously, if you're like Claudette in New York City, you're just not doing orthopedics, so they're getting no training unless they're doing it virtually. I think in Albany, they're still getting some training, but it's few and far between. And if this continues on for 12, 18 months, as predicted at some lower level, we're going to need to enhance that through other means, through virtual reality or simulation. The challenges for industry will be, how do you do those remote, and how do you do those without a huge platform, because we all can't be together.
And again, all of that, a lot of this can be done with industry support or funding support. And I guess you can probably, within a local hospital, access industry easier, certainly in the UK. Linking with industry on a regional level or in a, when you're allied to a residency program, it becomes a little bit harder because some of our rules of engagement. But again, we have that issue of sort of managing quality control.
From a resident engagement standpoint, one of the things that I think is really helpful is, you say, like virtual reality, augmented reality, and if there's different platforms by which they could do different procedures. So, you know, for example, right now, say we have hip, knee, and spine. What if one of the residents is like, you know, I feel comfortable with those, but I don't feel comfortable with ACL reconstructions, or I don't feel comfortable with a different type of surgical intervention, such as like an ankle fracture. You know, how can I get more practice doing this stepwise? Because the internet and our lectures offer maybe a step-by-step approach, but it's so different when you're actually manipulating equipment, trying to do things and pretending that you're doing the case itself. So having different surgical procedures would be ideal. That's one thing. Another thing too, I would say from an implant perspective is a lot of the fellows who are leaving after this year, they're going to go join their own practices, and in their own practices, they're going to have different equipment. So it might be really interesting to have modalities by which you have virtually, let's say, or, you know, through video, lay out all the trays, put out all the trays of all the different instrumentation you have, and literally one by one, go through the entire tray. So being familiar with the trays could actually be really helpful from a med ed perspective.
Invited local residents from other programs to join our education program and talked about partnering to share resources. And I think technology is really helps to facilitate that. So working together to optimize resident education. And I think there will be a lot more emphasis on surgical simulation and on VR to give an opportunity to practice in a environment and possibly independently, and to put the residents on a better point on the learning curve when they get to the operating room. Can you click again? And when they're working on real patients. So I think that there's a need for improved VR with more breadth of procedures available and better haptics. The VR can not only be used for practice, but also for assessing competencies. Right now, I think VR is ideal for junior residents to learn the steps of a procedure and maybe get the feel for certain instruments. But moving forward, I would anticipate that there'll be rapid progress in technology and the haptics and the breadth of procedures that are available. And I think that will really make VR a cornerstone for surgical simulation and resident training. And I think that's a big next step. Thank you. And these are.
Great, thank you, Rebecca, and thanks for sharing us that bit of video. So that was great to hear from some of the highlights from previous webinars, and now we want to get into the meat of it today. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Duncan Tennant, who is Professor of Orthopedic Education at St George's University of London. Professor Tennant, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Shall I run my just a few slides? Is that the best way of doing it?
Yes, please.
Okay, right. I'll just click on a couple of buttons then. So I'll share my screen. Have I been given permission to share? There we go. I'll share that. And get that. I have to excuse my slightly ancient computer. The new one arrives tomorrow. We'll get there. So, greetings from London. You just heard Alex Trompeter speak. He's a colleague of mine. We work very closely on a lot of the education stuff. And I'm the Professor of Orthopedic Education at the university. So we were asked a few questions in this. The concept of what are the key elements that should be included in a VR curriculum? Now, I may be coming at this from a different approach to those in the US. And I'm going to start at the bottom with these questions. So do we mean curriculum or do we mean syllabus? And this is a slightly pedantic educational point. Because if you're going to have a curriculum, it then becomes mandated. And it is something that is a requirement, which means that as a provider, you have to give them the tools to do it. You have to find a way of assessing it, and they can fail it. Whereas a syllabus is a recommendation. So we're just going to be a little bit careful about terminology. And it may be that you do mean a true curriculum, and certainly by the sounds of things, the Australian experiences, they do have a VR curriculum. If you do that, then everybody has to have access. And if you go step back with all of this, and it has been covered by last week's speakers or the previous speakers, what are we trying to achieve? What do we want our trainees to get out of this in terms of surgical ability, surgical understanding? And then the question becomes, how do we achieve that? So you have to go to the end first and work your way back. And then what are the solutions? So in any VR training program, any training program, it's the end of the product is I want to have trainees who are competent, independent surgeons, who are safe, understand the limitations, but basically have the skills. I'm going to achieve that by a number of modalities. Some of that is book learning, some of that is Viva type learning, and some of it is practical skills learning. And there are a number of solutions. Some of those may be VR, some of those may be simulators, sometimes it may be cadaveric, and sometimes it has to be in the operating room itself. There is no doubt that it's only when you get that certain level of stress do you really start to take on board what you're doing. And all the theory in the world doesn't work until you've actually put it into practice. So when looking at this then, I look back and say, well, where are we? What are the barriers and what are the solutions? And this is the UK perspective. It may be different. So where are we? We literally 2 months ago published this bit of work that is a survey of what is available in simulations, and not VR simulation. And I think the picture would look very different there. But where are we in terms of simulation provision in the United Kingdom? And basically, the darker the color here, the better. So you can see there's a huge discrepancy. The gray one, by the way, is one group for some bizarre reason, just didn't bother to join in. But you can see that some of this, really there is very, very little, and some of it provide an awful lot. So there's a huge range. And that comes back to my curriculum point, that color, that's all going to be the same color. If it's not all the same color, it cannot be mandated in any way. So what are the barriers? And it boils down really to these things. And again, we looked at this a few years ago, looking at the models of simulator. One of the big issues is price. You can go from a very simple 2 bits of wood and a screw and a drill to simulate a lag screw, costs you $20 for the whole lot, $50 if you put the drill in. Right the way through to some of the complicated arthroscopy trainers that are, you know, approaching $100,000 to buy, and huge licenses each year. So there's a big range. Now, it's great if you've got the money, but I don't think any of us probably have the cash to splash out on large numbers of $100,000 machines. That then comes down to the availability. And one of the big things for trainees is practice. There is absolutely no point in going there and doing an operation once in any environment, be it in the OR or on a simulator, if you never practice it again. We all know that you've got to practice. So if these things aren't available to you in an easy, ready to use format, now be that a room in your facility or at home. Now, most of us learned to tie surgical knots with shoelaces, bits of suture, bits of string around coffee cups at home. And we did thousands of them. When I did my arthroscopy fellowship, I was given a line of fishing line, a spool of fishing line and a knot pusher, and told, don't come back until you finish the spool. So I tied thousands of arthroscopic knots with fishing line. It's that practice. And then very importantly, and this comes out in the literature again and again, whatever we use has to be a validated educational tool. There are lots of bits of kit out there, and an awful lot of it has never had anybody, apart from the guy who invented it, validate it as a tool that enables you to learn. They all come out with fantastic face validity. All that means is, I've got a toy and I like using it. And then most people do what's called a construct validity, which demonstrates that a novice isn't as good on the toy as an expert. And you can run a little test and prove that your machine tells the difference between the two. What very few of the things do is demonstrate progression and then demonstrate that when you come out at the end, you are equivalent or close to equivalent to the expert. And the few studies that have made that transition have showed it's all down to practice, which brings us back to the validation, to the availability point. So those are the barriers for anything in this system at the moment. I was then asked, what would I want from industry? And again, this was highlighted by the previous speakers, is this business availability, which I've mentioned, and adaptability. A lot of these systems will teach you how to do one operation with one piece of kit. And that's great. If I want to know how to do a hip replacement or a knee replacement, because they're very popular. If I want to know how to do basic arthroscopy and chase a little ring or a little star around a simulated knee, it's great. But I need to be able to teach people how to do a shoulder replacement, slightly more niche, but actually the sort of thing that really needs your practice, because, you know, I do about 100 shoulder replacements a year. So any resident isn't going to get that many out of me compared to the hips. So probably they need more out of me. Likewise, arthroscopy. Chasing a little thing around a knee is not very useful. I need to get them to learn how to do a cuff repair. So I need that adaptability. And then one thing that I really want from industry, and this comes back to Dr. Chen's point from last time about the trays. And this is even more important with COVID. And as we go back into operating, we've got a team. No surgeon operates on their own. They have a team around them, assistants, anesthesia, scrub staff. They all need to know the operation. They need to know how to use the kit. And as we all start to get back in, we're all a little bit rusty. And this is going to carry on. And we need to somehow find a way of doing this simulation so that the whole team can get involved. And I think the team get left alone because they're not the big money. You know, I spend the money because I use the kit. These guys don't. So if I asked the industry for one thing, it would be, how do I train my team? So those are my thoughts on the questions I was asked, and I hope we'll sort of start to warm things up to debate. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Professor Tennant. That was really interesting. I think your points on validation are clearly valid in themselves, as well as your reference to the cost of hardware and the flexibility, making sure it's adaptable to suit to different programs, which is something at the core of what we're interested in as well. So thank you very much. I'm going to go over, we'll have a more open debate shortly. I'm going to go now to Dr. Balakuma, who I know he has some similar thoughts in this space. Dr. Balakuma, if I've said it once today, I'll say it 5 times. Thank you so much for joining us at 1 a.m. In the morning Melbourne time. Good to see you.
Thank you. So look, these are the institutions I work at, and my practice is a combination of private and public, and really most of my interest is in hip surgery, and I'm a very big proponent of innovation and technology, as well as adult education. One of the hospitals I work at, which is the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, that's the bottom picture is the walkway through the main hallway, so it's a very modern hospital. But I think what's happened in our education program is much like the UK. We have a nationalised education program, and the idea is that the resident that finishes across the country has the same standard. And I think this is where it differs from the US, perhaps, where some residency training programs have an incredible high fidelity training program and others maybe not as in depth, but I think that's one of the advantages. In my training, I'm doing a lot of resident training, lecture series, operating lists, and then involved in fellowship training, post-fellowship training, and I'm also a reference center for a different industry, and on design team for prosthesis. So following COVID, what's happened? I think we're all embracing technology, and again, the Australian Orthopedic Association, we have this new system called the AOA 21 in reference to 2021, and it's no longer going to be based on the number of years, it's going to be based on competencies. So someone who's going to have a baby and take time off will still be able to potentially finish their training program at the same duration if they're able to achieve all their core competencies within a certain allocated time. And you could complete it in 3 years or 7 years, which makes complete sense, because as long as you're able to achieve the same level of training, then that person is equivalent. As a result of COVID, our training program has gone from Friday bone schools in person to Zoom. They've gone into breakout rooms for individual patient assessments. On Saturdays, we would have it at hospitals. Now they're on breakout rooms, and we would do our conferences via Zoom, our teaching via Zoom, and then telehealth. The app that's relevant to this is the app has all these various assessment tools called TIMS, which allows us to assess the resident. And again, we're looking at core competencies. And I think this is where, during this time, I've been using telehealth to look at, get my residents to do assessments and then fill in the application form through the app. But I could see how this would then translate into the virtual reality platform. And I completely agree. It's not been validated to a level where I'd say, this can be a competency, but I think in the future, that's the goal we would have. So what sort of studies have been done on this? And out of the UK itself, out of Justin Cobb's group, they've looked at, again, this is a very low level validation, but they've looked at how using VR versus not using VR has allowed residents to perform at an almost independent level on cadavers and for a direct anterior approach. What about the industry roles? So I think one of the things people forget is industry spends huge amounts of money in educating surgeons. So on the right is a graph of how much Medtronic has spent in educational events, including conferences, sending people overseas, and dinners. And Johnson & Johnson spent up to $4.3 billion in 2015 for what were some of their defective hips and meshes and surgical staplers. And some of this may have been avoided potentially with better training of the people who are implanting these. So I think there's certainly a lot of scope for achieving some of this funding. What if you were getting into an A380? Which one of these guys would you like, or women would you like driving it? The guy on the right who looks old and more, who was one of my great mentors, or the guy on the left, or me as one of the fellows back there. And this is really interesting, because I think most of us are happy for our patients to be operated on someone who's a relative novice. Again, it differs from a public to private practice. And yet, if you get into a plane and find out someone is just training on the plane, you'd be extremely nervous. I think this is another great example of the level of which people get trained to prior to undertaking these. So the F-15 Air Force pilots spend a lot of time on their simulators, and they are able to land on one of these aircraft carriers in the middle of the night. They use a lot of tools available to them, but they also have incredible high fidelity training. And this guy on the right, Atul Gawande, really has done some great TED Talks on this, and talks about how surgeons, if you use an analogous to professional athletes, we all of a sudden stop training once we're finished. But we really don't. Most surgeons, I think, continue to strive to make themselves better. They do various sorts of training, but we're not doing hands-on training, because our hands-on training, some of it comes from the patient. But ultimately, all of our goal is to eliminate the unforced error. And if you have a look at the great tennis players of the modern era, they have the lowest levels of unforced errors. So if we go back to flight simulators, which really is probably the gold standard for how pilots are trained, and they avoid, pretty much eliminate unforced errors, they've compared that to then virtual reality and looked at the difference in cost. So they've used training again, F-15 Air Force pilots, and found that they were able to achieve the same target within 3 months that they would in 1 year with a flight simulator. We quite frequently talk about costs with VR machines, and the cost for a headset that's scalable, maybe not the same one as what we would use with fundamental with a haptic, but the scalability is huge. You can just get someone to take it home with a single, with the new headsets, is probably $1,000 as opposed to $4.5 million for a flight simulator. So what we need is an outcome-driven curriculum. And again, this is not validated by any of my training committees, but we need to look at probably to some extent proms. And again, this is where you would get industry supporting this. You need to get the big training programs across the world to develop core competencies for their training and incorporate this. And I think the concept should be that you should have the experienced novice, eliminate the learning curve. The registrar of tomorrow should be able to be equivalent to the consultant of today as a junior consultant. And a lot of this will be that they've trained countless hours, practice, as has already been pointed out, but not just their knots, not just with a spool, but with something way more high fidelity, and be able to do the operation on this before they even get there. Eliminate unforced errors. And then I think the future would be that I myself should be getting continued CPD training using these, again, analogous to professional athletes and how we train. Certainly when a new prosthesis is included, I think VR should be part of their certification. So for the Mako robot, for example, they have extremely high levels of training before they certify you. They put you through a cadaver workshop, but again, you can eliminate a lot of the costs. So for us at the Austin Hospital, and I've got to acknowledge Anton Lambers, who's the trainee who ran the study, we did a hub. We've got a virtual reality hub, and we basically run a model on a feasibility study. Impetus was we really want to get away from that apprentice model and increase our skill complexity very quickly and have the residents be extremely competent in a short period of time. We want the pre-trained novice. Mr. Hardinge is the head of unit at our department, and this is one of the public hospitals I work at, has a very great continuum. He wants to introduce the students, residents, and registrars to the procedure. Train registrars, we find that there's a huge variation as they rotate from rotation to rotation. So the standard for the patients drop as you get a new set of registrars. If we can get rid of that variability by training them on the machine before they come in, then I think that's a huge step up. And then we also train them a way of how we perform it. So again, back to the concept of having the staff, the whole team trained up and simulate complications. Our results are that the hardware setup costs and the software is relatively expensive for a public hospital in Australia. The feasibility for the haptic setup, we try to make it as portable as possible, but nevertheless, it takes a good 10 to 15 minutes to set it up at every new location. But again, with the new headsets that Fundamental can give out, we can improve the scalability and portability. We've all seen how this works in real time, but the actual software itself at this stage is extremely high fidelity. And from my point of view, I can only see this improving dramatically as time goes on. And this is an example of a mallet being used with the haptic feedback. So this was the spread of people who use this. So we had 24 respondents, and we had senior consultants, trainees, and unaccredited registrars. And the majority of people said that they recommend virtual reality as part of their training to a colleague. What's interesting in this one is 21% felt that even a senior consultant would find this type of technology useful, but most people felt that it was most useful for the non-training registrar. I think the discussion from this is that leadership is really probably the key. We've got to get very enthusiastic personnel like the people who are on today to really push for this and incorporate this perhaps as a part of the syllabus. And I think in the future as part of the curriculum, certainly not in Australia, it's not part of the curriculum. So I hope I didn't miscommunicate that last time, but I think in the future it'll become probably a government legislated type of training. So for me in the future, what I'd like is every resident to own a VR unit where you can upload software for any new industry. It's scalable, not just to one company, to multiple companies. You can put in their curriculum. You can put in surgeon workflows. They'll go, okay, I'm going to go start my new rotation at this hospital, and the surgeon workflows in there. And you can mandate it as a core competency. And for surgeons, we can mandate it as a CME. I certainly think the money would be well spent here, much better than sending them off to conferences overseas where large amounts of money is wasted. And I think the industry would certainly be on board with that. And I think it allows open disclosure to patients about the hours spent. Right now, some of our patients don't know who exactly is operating on them in terms of their experience. And certainly I think it's great marketing for industry and for hospitals, because I'll say, look, all our surgeons and trainees are credentialed using the basic training from the VR. Thank you, and I'll stop there.
That was really great. Thank you very much. There's a number of points in there. Pick any out in particular. I think the idea of eliminating unforced error is fantastic, and it's really interesting to hear that in Australia you're working on more of a competency based rather than time based, and clearly that provides great opportunities for diversity in education as well, which is fantastic. I'm going to now, we'll come back to some of those points. I'm going to go now back over to Rebecca, who's going to run another poll for us. Rebecca.
Yep, so we have the second question today, which I'm just going to share with you. So this is going to help us understand the kind of features which people feel would be most beneficial as part of a VR platform. So can you select, please, the top 3 of the options below, in your opinion, the things that you feel are most important in a VR platform? Great, I can see some votes coming in. That's fantastic. So we'll give this another few minutes to run. I can see about half of people have voted now. That's great. So if I can just allow a few more minutes for the remaining votes to come in. Okay, that's great. So I'll end that polling there and hand back over to Chris.
Thank you, Rebecca. And now to a panelist who's joined us on a couple of these before. It's a real pleasure, as always, to welcome Dr. Stephanie Pearce, who joins us from somewhere a bit sunnier than here in Colorado, I hope. So Dr. Pearce is a fellow in pediatric and also sports soon, I believe, as well, which is really exciting. So congratulations on that. And she also represents the AOS for us today, as she is the Vice Chair of the Residents' Assembly. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Pearce.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be part of such a distinguished panel and group, and love getting to talk about some of this. So I'll share my screen right now, and we'll get started. Okay, So this diagram is part of the Academy's AAOS's 5-year strategic plan. And the goals here are to, 1, improve member experiences in a personalized and seamless way, which virtual reality does using new technology to bring more understanding and hands-on repetitions to learners. Next is advancing the quality of orthopedic care, which is easily done using a virtual reality modeling and practice sessions. Finally, the third component of the strategic plan is to evolve the culture to become more strategic, innovative, and diverse, which virtual reality lends itself to naturally, especially in terms of strategy and innovation. And so these are the core values and key enablers, and you can see here that technology is a key enabler for this strategic plan of the Academy to help bring these goals to fruition. And one reason why I want to kind of bring that up, as you can tell, is it seamlessly integrates in with our webinar today in terms of virtual reality and curriculum versus syllabi. And so what are kind of things that aspects of the VR curriculum that is in light of these goals it's important to include? And I would say having levels to reach all years of training and practice by having varying degrees of complexity, building appropriate level clinical questions to accompany each stage. And so these are going to be really important to help not only hit your certain milestones, but also important to, as Dr. Balkumar mentioned, kind of heading more towards that competency based. And so you can really escalate and move forward along your own path based on what your base knowledge is, which may be different for every intern or every medical student, and then kind of building all the way up, not only to chief resident fellow level, but also into practice and beyond, whether it's a new technique or something that's more common that just has had less exposure for that individual. Allowing for multi-user functions is going to be really important to delve into a new world of depth, if you will, allowing group-based learning and even bringing in a mentor to help practice, assist, or teach certain aspects of a procedure, if not all of it. Additionally, practice management is one of the components of the Academy's member services and focuses to help teach surgeons how to handle the practice management side of their own practice with billing and coding. And virtual reality could easily reinforce this by building in some coding and billing questions at the end of a virtual reality session and simulation to help conclude and kind of wrap into a bow the complete picture of what's going to happen on a normal operative day. In terms of my preferences from a fellow standpoint and a learner's perspective, is having the ability to tailor the subject to whether it's a rotation that I'm on or where it's an interest, a case of interest at the moment. Being able to kind of pick, and some of the current electronic learning curricula, if you will, really kind of narrow you down into, no, this in March, everyone across the country will be looking at total joints. Well, if I'm going to be on a pediatric rotation and looking at pediatric foot and ankle, I would really rather learn how to, do a Dwyer-Evans or a cotton osteotomy instead. And so having the ability to tailor that for what is needed is going to be very valuable for the learner. Additionally, the ability to go at your own pace. So when you're on rotations that are heavier, being allowed to kind of be a little bit more behind, if you will, and then on rotations that are lighter, really being able to not only catch up, but go beyond and to advance past where the current time point is extremely valuable, as everybody's months and days look different throughout the year. Bookmarking procedures or steps will allow easy review of procedures and refreshing on steps before a case. And then finally, the ability to make notes. So being able to make the notes during the virtual reality simulation and refer back to the notes when revisiting a VR procedure can help gain at least 1 to 2 more repetitions to get closer to the mastery of a concept or component of the case. And I would say most importantly, the ability to have home VR units for each resident to use at home or at whatever location they are at really allows more repetitions and learning, as well as the 3D and hands-on preparation for cases that they can do before they happen. And so in terms of incorporating industry into this educational component, having detailed mock virtual reality trays, as has been mentioned multiple times, really allows learners to kind of cycle through the trays, compare the nuances by actually practicing and going through the procedure step by step. It's extremely valuable when working with different attendings who use different equipment, as has been previously mentioned, as well as practicing the night before, and even for deciding for your own practice. I'm about to enter my own practice in the next couple of years, or in next year, and deciding which instrument set do I want. And some places where I may take a job is I'll be limited by what the you know, what they already have and what the current contracts are, etc. But there are other aspects where I'll be able to have a say onto what kind of equipment I would like to use. And so having a true view of every aspect of industry and every brand's version of a screw or a total joint set or spine fusion equipment, etc., is really important to be able to see how it feels and see how it goes, and that may fit better for my hands versus another's. And so that is a huge component that could really be valuable for both industry as well as the trainee. And then at that point, once you have the good equipment, everyone can be smiling in the OR, because we all know how to use the equipment, how to open the packages, how to mix things together, and what to expect. And so finally, for the industry support wish list, I would say my number one request would be getting the equipment into the hands of the trainees. We can't try, practice, train, or learn on virtual reality without the equipment to use it. So this is easily the largest hurdle to overcome, dissemination of the devices. However, building the curriculum is critical to more programs coming on board and buying the equipment. But no matter how excellent the curricula is, if there's no device, there's no virtual reality learning. So, but if the industry can help get these projects into the learners' hands, then the largest feat will be accomplished, which would be great. Thank you.
That is great. Thank you very much, Dr. Pearce. A couple of points I'd pick out of there is the discussion around flexibility, both in terms of where you're able to learn and also in terms of the timing. That was a really interesting point, which goes back to Dr. Balakuma's points as well, in terms of competency rather than automatically you are at this stage in your training. The ability to have some movement in there is very interesting. So thank you very much for that again. I'm going to go over now to NYU and Dr. Agarwal. Thank you very much again for joining us today, Dr. Agarwal. Second time I've seen you today. We'll come more to that shortly. So thank you very much, and over to you.
All right, thanks for having me, Chris, and the Fundamental team. I'm just gonna push over my slides and share my screen here. All right, are you guys able to see that? Perfect. All right, so I think everybody so far, this distinguished panel, and I think thanks for including me on it, but everyone so far has reiterated a lot of the points that I think we're all thinking about right now. And the bottom line is that simulation in orthopedics, and specifically orthopedic surgery, is at this point, no pun intended, a virtual reality as far as moving forward. It's not going to be, do we want this or do we not? It's a reality that we're all facing, and for better or for worse, I told Chris this earlier, the pandemic time that we're in has really driven home a punch to get this started. And a lot of the work has been done outside the States. And now in the United States, we just have extra ammo, if you will, to get this to go into the next era. So I just wanted to take a step back. I think we all know why virtual reality is so important, but just from a historical perspective, this is something that I think we see in academic centers again and again and again. And so you kind of have the three stages of your surgeon career paths. And so you have your old timers that have been around for, decades now in practice, and you have your middle generation, and then you have your trainees. And so I think that the biggest issue that we're facing with our trainees in the United States now is the touches, the number of touches that they're having on live patients, combined with the problem with work hours. and how residents are no longer quote unquote residents in the hospital and staying overnight for all weekend. The old timers will tell you that back in my day, we used to sleep in the hospital from Friday night to Monday morning and just touch patients, operate, do surgeries all weekend. But that's gone by the wayside due to various factors, for better or for worse. And so I think that the reality of the situation is that although surgery still works the most hours out of all the fields, I think it still has gotten to the point where we're still lacking enough touches to really go forward and feel comfortable. And so the reason that people aren't as comfortable coming out, and I've spoken to some of our residents as they leave, is a fewfold. And one of them has been them surprisingly telling me that a lot of the patients just don't want residents or trainees or fellows operating on them. Now, this is more, I think, particular towards private hospitals in the United States, for example, but it's a growing problem even in our academic centers. And so what I would say is that when I go through our rotations, it's time and time again that on the elective side of surgery, patients really are shying away from having, and as a result, attending surgeons are shying away from having students or residents or trainees touch the patient as much as they used to maybe 20, 30 years ago. The bottom line is that a lot of studies have looked at this, and I think that unfortunately in our public press, we haven't gotten the message out yet enough that trainees and training hospitals are actually good for patient care. And we can drive this point home even more so. I think Dr. Balakumar made the point that showing patients the number of virtual touches that our trainees are getting will get them a level of confidence and ease that they're looking for before they undergo this potentially life-changing operation. And so this is just a summary of why residents might be getting less touches over the years. We talked about the patient safety issue. The other thing that I want to touch base on, again, especially in the United States, is the hospital cost issue, right? So even at academic centers in 2020, hospitals are looking to become more efficient, turn over more cases as fast as they can, move the surgeries to the outpatient setting, whether it's a hip or knee replacement or spine surgeries even, and try to get patients in and out as quickly as possible to drive down hospital costs and drive up revenue. Now all this, and then lastly, they're measuring our surgeon metrics like crazy. So regardless of whether you're a training hospital or not, you're getting measured by how fast you're going, how good your outcomes are, any complications, any readmissions. All of this is to say how much room are we really left for with autonomy and trainee learning. And so I think going forward, we knew that getting surgical touches for trainees was a problem to begin with, but now with COVID, I think it's even more exponentially driven. And this is reflecting the fact that the operative volume is down, the decrease in essential staff is down. And we really got to figure out, this is a reason why virtual reality is going to take off in the United States after this pandemic. So this is just a slide on the COVID time, and this was between, I guess, March and just last month, end of May. We had dedicated teams that were not doing orthopedic surgery at all. And so the residents were, part of the proning team, which is in the ICUs, or they were taking intensive care shifts overnight as well. And this is, thankfully, we're starting to see the other side of this. And now in New York City, at least, we're up to about 50% to 60% of our normal elective orthopedic surgery volume capacity in June. So obviously, I touched base on how simulation training can alleviate this. But turning this over to the industry standpoint, I think this portion right here, the cost, is what we can really tackle. And so I think, traditionally, previously, we had people go to industry-sponsored courses, and I benefited from those significantly as a trainee when I was a resident and a fellow. And I think that really is going to be having to shift towards the virtual reality platform and industry funding that, as courses and business travel in the United States has been pretty much virtually shut down throughout 2020 at our institution, and that's no longer going to be an option. So really, to cut down or transition the cost over from courses that are live and cost people's times to in-home atmosphere, as Stephanie was pointing out, I think that's going to be the valuable way going forward here. So how to start this? Well, I think that you really have to start small. And you know, a small study done at NYU last year really exhibited the utility of this, and they really randomized all the new coming interns. We have 14 interns a year, and they literally looked at only one procedure, total hip arthroplasty, with one group of type of trainee, that is people that have never done surgery before. And half of them underwent the VR training, half of them didn't. And there was a statistically significant improvement in their technical performance. So that was a very small group and a small subset that they were looking at. And now we've expanded that idea and submitted for a grant where we're now going to implement this for multiple procedures. Again, starting with one procedure and a group of residents, measuring multiple metrics, especially those that are available through software like Fundamentals, and then moving forward and expanding that to an entire residency, which is comprised of, we're lucky to have 72 resident or trainees in our program at any given point, which is the largest in the country here. And as we get through this, Stephanie and Jeet brought this up, that you're going to have to expand this to multiple procedures, not just one. And over time, the utility is going to be having industry support some of this through grant funding or conferences, et cetera, that are virtual. I think that, I'll close here and just reiterating some of the points that I think specifically we really need to drive home. And that's a beautiful point made about the implants, and the implants and the instrumentation is going to be key. I won't harp too much on that because I think that that's an obvious one, and it's extremely, extremely beneficial. We all have spent years trying to master different instruments, only to go to another system and have to relearn that all over again. So if we can consolidate that learning process in a virtual setting before we even get into the operating room, I think that's going to be huge. Now, just to wrap up, I think that the next step, as far as we're concerned, is to see, with remote options that we're considering right now, how can we utilize this technology and this modalities with industry support? And one of those is going to be through things like medical student away rotations or sub-internships. And I think that that's going to allow people to have an experience about what does orthopedics have to offer before I go into that as a career choice. And then from the residency standpoint, from the training program standpoint, how can we measure students' capabilities without meeting them in person for a month, because they won't be able to do those away rotations. And so I think that what we'll see in the future is we're going to have virtual reality simulation platforms where it's going to be part of an objective metric to acceptance into a United States residency. And I envision in 5, maybe 10 years, maybe even sooner, hopefully, that along with the USMLE score, along with step 1, step 2, along with your case logs for ACGME graduation, how you perform on VR simulation training with those metrics is going to be a requirement, both to get into residency and to graduate. And I really feel that that's going to be combined with the AAOS's advocacy. That's going to be the next step we're going to see in the United States. So again, this is aligning with AAOS and simulation softwares like Fundamentals. I think we're ready at NYU to take the next step to plan that. And I just want to thank you guys again for having us as we go through these very difficult, but obviously whenever you go through difficult times, I think it's ripe for opportunity to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agwal. That's really useful. Some very good points there in terms of keeping those surgical touches up and the potential in the future to evaluate even pre-residents. And I know that's something that is of interest to yourself. We're just running towards the end now. So before we go to the Q&A, I'm going to do a really quick poll over with Rebecca.
Yeah, no worries. So we'll just take a couple of minutes to do this one. This is nicely following on from some of the things that we've heard from our panelists already, looking at the kind of tools that we could build into simulation, really following on from Dr. Antonia Chen's comment in the previous webinar, mentioning the value of, for example, having the trays from different manufacturers as part of the simulation. So if you want to just vote, you can vote for as many of the below as you feel would be beneficial, just to give us an idea of the features you would like to see. So we'll just give this a few seconds for as many people as possible to vote. Great, so about half of people have voted now. So I'm going to end that one there just because I know that we need to move on. Thanks everyone that voted there.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. And so, Rebecca, I think one of the things we're going to do now is play a really short video just before we go to the panel discussion. Earlier today, we were working through one of our simulations with Dr. Agarwal in NYU, and we asked him to share a couple of minutes of thoughts on how simulations from us or from any VR company could be modified for the benefit of resident education by incorporating med device companies' content. And here's that video of that walkthrough.
Dr. Agarwal, is there anything else that you think would be useful in the context of this room and this space in general for this kind of training?
Yeah, I think actually just to kind of touch on the point of the tray table that you mentioned and the implants, every implant design and instrument is a little bit different. And so regardless of whether you're doing a total knee procedure for the first time or the 100th time, if you're using a different instrument set, it can be a little bit difficult to get accustomed to the first time. And so if your hospital is using instrument sets that are pretty consistent for a majority of your cases, it might be worthwhile for trainees to learn that specific implant design and instrument set from the company that you're using. And that can include significant portions of the case like this, where the tibial alignment jig has different buttons and different ways to align the cutting block so that you're getting an accurate representation each time. So I think that that's something that familiarize yourself with in the virtual setting is extremely helpful and would be a step ahead to get into the operating room and know your implant and instruments before you get in there.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, so if you can kind of, yeah, exactly. If you can look at this, you can see, you know, if we had industry make their specific sizing guide for their femur, for example, that way you can really get accustomed to a implant company's sizing guide and how to adjust it, what the options are, and how it pivots in different directions to account for rotation, AP diameter, and things of that nature, which again, make a big difference as you're going from implant company to implant company, regardless of whether you're doing a total knee, like I said, after 100 cases or for the first time.
Great, that's perfect, thank you.
Great, and so just to follow on from that video and the comments from Dr. Agarwal, we just have one final poll that we're going to run today before I hand back over to Chris. So this is just a simple yes or no regarding if a med device company were to offer a branded simulation, how likely would you be to incorporate that into your curriculum? Of course, providing it meets the required educational standards. So we'll just give everybody a few minutes to vote on this one as well, and then I'll hand back over to Chris for the last few moments of our session today.
Thank you. And just while you're doing that, if obviously it's a fairly straightforward question, if you do have as attendees, if you have any opinions on what does and doesn't work in that space, then please do share them with us as well, and we'll publish those questions and answers separately after this. That's been really useful. I think we've also had a question has come in, which was a really interesting one, and Dr. Balakuma has answered it directly in terms of should industry be focused on the younger surgeons who are in training or the older ones. Now, from my perspective, I see an environment where the money, and I think Professor Tennant made this point, the money is sitting with the older surgeons who make the decisions about the implants in the hospital, etc. But the immediate opportunity is to influence the residents in training. It's about taking a long-term perspective. In the past, I've talked to a number of different med device companies. One from based in Florida has a very long-term opinion, and it's great that they're prepared to invest in the future. But I just want to throw that open. What does the panel feel about young surgeons or where the money is? It's kind of loaded again.
Who do you want to start?
Professor Tenton, that's great, thank you.
I think what's interesting is I spoke to one of the implant companies, predominantly arthroscopy, some years ago about sponsoring fellows. And they said, no, we don't do it anymore simply because the fellows go off and use whatever they're being told that they're going to use in the practice they move into. So they moved away from it. So I think there is the shift into the surgeons, which I don't think is right. And the other issue, as I didn't really introduce myself too much in my day-to-day job, I am a shoulder surgeon, predominantly arthroscopic. And yeah, it's big business for certain companies, but it's not a fraction of what you see for the arthroplasty companies. So they are investing, and I'm not knocking fundamental in any way, but you've got hip and knee replacement, because that's where the money is. And if you look at the arthroscopy simulators, to be honest, they're not a patch on what you're doing, when they are so far behind that trainees are never going to get the arthroscopic experience because nobody's willing to invest that money. So hearing all the other speakers, I think my wish list would be to have it mandated from government to say, you're an implant company, if you want to sell your product, then you are going to put some money into global education. That's the scrub staff who never get anything, the residents, the young guys and the old guys. And top slice that and say, you don't even get a foot in the door. And that way they can invest in someone like you to produce the product that keeps us all happy. That would be my wish list. Rant over.
Thank you. It's very constructive, positive rant. Anybody else from the US with a view on that, or indeed Australia?
I think there is. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go right ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there is a focus on some of the more established surgeons right now, just because I would say that the volume is coming from them. And right now we're seeing in the United States, at least, volume talks, whether you're in an academic center or a private center. We're looking in an era where surgical volume is king. And it's really a numbers game. And so the industry is looking to older surgeons to drive that. There is a little bit, however, of an opportunity that industry is looking for in graduating fellows to make sure they try to capture them early as well as they're coming out of training. So I don't think it's necessarily one or the other, but if I had to say what it's geared towards right now, it's probably the older surgeons that have the volume. And I don't disagree at all. I think it should be something that, as we get further along in this, mandatory at some level. And I do think that I firmly believe in due time that VR metrics are going to become part of the requirements from surgical training programs for their trainees, whether that's acceptance into the program or graduation from.
Thank you. Stephanie, I think you had a point, Dr. Pearce.
Yeah, so from a trainee standpoint, currently, I've kind of watched this throughout the year, which I thought was really interesting. But first of all, I agree with both Professor Tennant's points and Dr. Agarwal's points. But as from the fellows standpoint, and this may be because of where I'm located in Colorado, and it may be different for different fellowships, but we've had, and just with PEDS having it just be a general type of practice where we've from head to toe, we're operating and therefore using a lot of different companies. But as all the different companies have come through, the reps have been very open about offering, oh, we have this fellows course, oh, we have this, we'd love to get you there, things like that. And it's been extremely fortunate. Because of COVID, they all canceled because they were all due for later in the year. And so as it's been brought up on previous webinars as well as today, is since those courses are not happening, since those thousands of dollars are not being required for travel, food, hotel stays, etc., hopefully we can use some of that money from industry to potentially help get us into training on a virtual reality standpoint.
Thank you. And I will, sorry, Carrie, go ahead.
I was going to make a point. I think with respect, I completely agree. I think it should be government mandated, and potentially the industry should be actually putting the funding into a pool rather than having branding. And I think, you know, they have to take responsibility for some of the training. There's certainly inequalities, and look, I am lucky because Johnson & Johnson fund my fellowship, but they also see the business side of it, in that every fellow I train is equivalent to 200 to 300 joints per year for them if they get it on the other side, and quite often they do. But I've seen a lot of stories where trainees who've just finished, they might have had some experience where they've wanted to do a visitation with a surgeon in Oxford or elsewhere, or quite commonly in Lyon in France, and they don't get to do it, and they, you know, vow to never use that implant company again. So it's crazy how I think people forget the influence that the younger surgeons can play in the future. And I think industry now, you know, they have metrics on how they measure us. They see certain surgeons have huge spheres of influence. They know how some surgeons can infiltrate lots of other surgeons and actually alter the way they think. And there's certainly now more and more younger surgeons, or the trainees who are coming through, I think, who are way better trained than when I would have finished, who are going to be incredible at passing on that information to even greater numbers of people. So I think that's where they should be investing their money personally. But
thank you. Dr. Agwal, did you have a final point as we're running?
Yeah, I think one of the comments that was asked here, it sounds like, is how it's going to benefit industry directly. And I think, just to sum up both Dr. Balakumar's and Dr. Pearce's comments, is that really they were already funding a lot of this, right, through the courses and the cadaver labs and all that stuff. So at least for the short term, it can be a transition of funds over to that side. But in the long term, I think that this isn't going to go away. It's not just a stopgap or a Band-Aid. I do think that they will benefit from having trained, like Dr. Balakumar said, a significant portion of younger surgeons that are going to now be familiar with their products and come out and hopefully utilize them. So it should benefit them significantly.
Great, thank you very much. So we've had one more point which has come in from Mr. Omar Sabri, who is a consultant orthopedic surgeon down in sunny St. George's in London. And so I'm going to wrap up on his point. He makes the point that what obstacles do VR companies come across? I think as a VR company, like some of the others that are in the market, we think there's an immense opportunity that COVID has presented for education and for these industry partners to get involved. And we think that's something that I'm sure our competitors and collaborators would be keen to be involved in as well. So this is a real time where we can really make a difference in this space. So looking forward to it. I want to thank everybody who's joined us today. This is really powerful conversation with regard to the flexibility that we can bring into training, the diversity that we can bring into training. We've talked previously on webinars about the ability, playing behind me, to incorporate multi-user, and that is something, multi-user and remote came out in most of the discussions we've had today, and I think that's an interesting experience area that we should be focusing on quite a lot. So without further ado, thank you very much for everybody. We've run over by a few minutes, but it was great to get those final thoughts in from you all. So I appreciate all the attendees for joining us, and the panel today. A special mention to Dr. Balakuma for joining us in the middle of the night again. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having us. Have a good
day. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good one.